I never thought I'd be the one to break the unspoken rules at Mercer & Shaw. For 7 years, I had climbed the ranks of the consulting firm with careful precision, becoming the youngest senior project manager in the company's history. The London TILA Stadium office had become my second home, sometimes my only home as I navigated client demands and corporate politics with what everyone called impressive finesse. What they really meant was that I knew when to push and when to bend, when to speak, and when to listen. It was a delicate dance I had mastered until the Cambridge project landed on my desk. The pharmaceutical client wanted to streamline their research division, which everyone in the room understood meant cutting jobs and consolidating power. I was handed the brief by Richard Dalton, our managing director, who had personally selected me for what he called a career-making opportunity. His steel-gray eyes had lingered on mine as he slid the folder across the polished conference table. "Emily, this one needs your particular touch. Diplomacy, efficiency, discretion." What the brief didn't mention was that the company was developing breakthrough treatments for rare childhood diseases. The research team scheduled for optimization had been making remarkable progress on a medication that could help thousands of children. Their funding was deemed excessive by executives who wanted quicker returns for shareholders. I spent 3 weeks at their facility, interviewing researchers, analyzing workflows, and gathering data. Dr. Amelia Chen, the lead scientist, walked me through their labs one evening when most of the staff had gone home. Her dedication was palpable as she showed me images of children whose lives might change because of their work. "We know cuts are coming," she said quietly, her voice steady but her eyes betraying her concern. "We just hope whoever makes those decisions understands what's at stake." I nodded non-committally, the way consultants are trained to do. But inside, something was shifting. For the first time in my career, I couldn't separate the clinical business analysis from the human impact. These weren't just numbers on spreadsheets. These were lives, hopes, futures. Back at our office, I found myself staring at my preliminary report. The team was working at peak efficiency given their constraints. Any significant cuts would jeopardize their progress. The ethical choice was clear, but the business directive was equally clear. Richard wanted a 30% reduction in operating costs, and my report was due tomorrow. That night I stayed late, the office emptying around me as London's lights came on, outside my window. I rewrote the report 3 times, trying to find language that would satisfy Richard while protecting the research team. Each version felt like a betrayal, either of my company or my conscience. At 2 a.m. I made my decision. I drafted a report that recommended minimal disruption to the core research team, offsetting costs through other operational adjustments. It wasn't what Richard wanted, but it was what I could live with. When I presented my findings the next morning, Richard's expression darkened with each slide. The conference room felt airless as I concluded. "Therefore, I recommend against significant personnel reductions in the research division." The silence that followed was deafening. My colleagues shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Richard's voice, when he finally spoke, was dangerously calm. "Emily, would you join me in my office?" As we walked down the corridor, I could feel the eyes of the entire floor on my back. I had just broken the cardinal rule. I had let personal ethics override client directives. In our world, that wasn't principle, it was insubordination. I knew, as Richard closed his office door behind us, that I had just set fire to the career I had so carefully built. What I didn't know was that this moment would reshape not just my professional future, but my understanding of what success truly meant. Richard didn't waste time with pleasantries. He perched on the edge of his desk, arms crossed over his expensive suit. "What exactly was that, Emily?" His voice was quiet but tense, like a wire about to snap. I stood my ground, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "My professional assessment based on comprehensive analysis." "No," he cut me off. "That was you forgetting who signs your checks. The client doesn't want your moral compass. They want results. They want efficiency. They want what we promise them. Even if it means derailing research that could save children's lives." The words left my mouth before I could filter them. Richard's expression shifted from anger to Something colder. Don't be dramatic. Companies restructure all the time. That's business. If you can't handle that reality, perhaps you're in the wrong field. He pushed away from his desk and walked to the window, his back to me. I've invested a lot in you, Emily. Fast-tracked your promotions, put you on premium clients, defended you when the partners questioned if you were too young for senior management. The implied threat hung in the air between us. I had a choice to make. Right there in that sunlit office with London sprawling below us. I could recant, revise my report and safeguard my career. Or I could stand by my assessment and face the consequences. I understand what you've done for me, I said carefully. But I can't in good conscience recommend cuts that would effectively kill this research program. Richard turned slowly. Then you leave me no choice. You're removed from the Cambridge project effective immediately. Mark will take over. And I'm placing a formal note in your file about your refusal to meet client expectations. A career death sentence delivered so casually. I felt strangely calm as I nodded. I understand. Do you? He stepped closer. Because from where I'm standing, you're throwing away a future most people would kill for. Over what? Some researchers you met for a few weeks? That's not how this game is played. Maybe I don't want to play that game anymore. The realization crystallized as I spoke the words. Then perhaps Mercer and Shaw isn't where you belong. His gaze was challenging. I took a deep breath. Perhaps you're right. For a moment, Richard looked genuinely surprised. He had expected me to break, to apologize, to beg for another chance. That was the pattern, how people survived in our cutthroat industry. But something had fundamentally changed inside me during those weeks at the research facility. Are you resigning? He asked, his tone suggesting he didn't believe I had the courage. I need time to consider my options, I replied, surprising myself with my steadiness. But I won't be changing my assessment of the Cambridge situation. Then clear your calendar for the rest of the week. You're suspended pending review by the partners. Security will escort you out, standard protocol. The humiliation was deliberate. Everyone would see. Everyone would know. In consulting, your reputation was everything, and mine was being systematically dismantled. As I was walked through the office by a stone-faced security guard, I caught glimpses of my colleagues' reactions. Some looked away, uncomfortable with witnessing my downfall. Others watched with naked ambition in their eyes, already calculating how my projects might be redistributed. James, my closest ally on the team, gave me a slight nod, the barest acknowledgement that I wasn't entirely alone. Outside on the pavement, still clutching my bag, I felt oddly weightless. 7 years of grinding work, political navigation, and personal sacrifices, all potentially destroyed by one moment of ethical clarity. I should have been devastated. Instead, beneath the shock and uncertainty, I felt the first stirrings of something unexpected. Relief. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Brave thing you did today. If you want to talk, call me. Amelia. Chen? I stared at the screen, wondering how the research lead had already heard about what happened. News traveled fast in professional circles, especially when it involved someone falling from grace. But her reaching out suggested something I hadn't considered. That my stand, however costly to my career, had been noted by the very people I had tried to protect. As London's familiar noise swirled around me, I realized I was standing at a crossroads far more significant than a mere career setback. The question wasn't just what I would do next, but who I would become in the aftermath of this choice. The suspension stretched into an uncomfortable limbo. For days, I haunted my flat in Islington, alternating between frantic job searches and staring at my silent phone. The partners were taking their time, which couldn't be a good sign. Meanwhile, London continued its relentless pace outside my windows, indifferent to my personal crisis. On the 4th day, I finally called Dr. Chen. We met at a small cafe near Regent's Park, far from both our workplaces. Amelia arrived in a rush of autumn air, her practical bob slightly windblown. She didn't waste time with sympathy. They're pushing ahead with the cuts, she said after ordering tea. Your replacement presented recommendations yesterday. 40% staff reduction, restructured research priorities. The board approved it unanimously. The news hit me like a physical blow. All that moral stand-taking, and for what? The outcome was worse than if I'd just complied with Richard's demands. "I'm sorry," I said, feeling the inadequacy of the words. "I tried, but—" "Don't apologize," Amelia interrupted. "That's not why I asked to meet. What you did might not have stopped them, but it matters that someone in your position even tried." She leaned forward. "And it's given some of us an idea." She explained that a faction within the company, led by her and the research director, had been quietly preparing for this scenario. They had secured private funding to spin off as an independent research entity. But they needed someone who understood both corporate strategy and their scientific mission. "We need someone like you," she said plainly. "Someone who can translate between our world and the business reality without losing sight of what's important." I nearly laughed from the shock. "You want to hire me? I'm currently suspended and about to be spectacularly fired. I'm not exactly an asset right now." "On the contrary, your ethical stand makes you precisely what we need." I stirred my untouched tea, mind racing. "It's a huge risk for all of us. Staying put would be the bigger risk, for the research and the patients waiting for these treatments." Her eyes held mine steadily. "Think about it, but don't take too long." That night, as I weighed my options, my phone rang. James calling from a noisy pub after hours. "Thought you should know," he said, voice low despite the background clamor. "Mark's gutting the entire Cambridge research division. It's brutal, and Richard's making sure everyone knows you're being made an example of." My stomach twisted. "How are you holding up?" A bitter laugh. "Let's just say I'm updating my CV. The place is toxic since you left. Richard's on a warpath, making sure no one else gets ideas about challenging client directives." He paused. "Look, I didn't just call to gossip. Gordon Taylor from Innovative Health reached out to me. He heard what happened and wanted your contact info." Gordon Taylor, the head of one of the largest healthcare investment funds in Europe. We'd worked with him briefly last year. He said, and I quote, "Anyone with the backbone to stand up to Richard Dalton over research integrity is someone I want to talk to." James lowered his voice further. "This could be your soft landing, Em." After we hung up, I stood at my window watching the city lights. 2 unexpected lifelines in one day when I'd been preparing for career devastation. Both opportunities stemmed directly from the very action I thought had destroyed my professional life. The next morning, I received the formal termination letter from Mercer and Shaw. The language was coldly professional, but the subtext was clear. I had violated the firm's values and client commitments. Alongside it came a cease and desist warning about approaching any current clients or discussing internal matters, thinly veiled as a reminder of confidentiality obligations. They were afraid, not just of what I might say, but of what my choice represented, that their carefully constructed system of profit above all could be challenged from within. I met with Gordon Taylor the following day. His office in Canary Wharf commanded a view of the Thames, but his approach was refreshingly direct. "I've been watching Mercer and Shaw consume talented people for years," he said, after minimal pleasantries. "They recruit the brightest minds, then systematically train them to ignore their best instincts in favor of whatever makes the most money quickest." He slid a proposal across his desk, funding for Amelia's independent research initiative with a structure that would preserve scientific integrity while ensuring sustainable operations, and he wanted me to build and lead the operational side. "Why trust me with this?" I asked. "You barely know me." Gordon's weathered face creased in a smile. "When someone shows you who they are at great personal cost, that's the most reliable character reference there is." As I left his office, my phone vibrated with a text from Amelia. "Decision time. The team is meeting tonight to finalize plans." Standing on the Thames embankment, watching boats navigate the currents, I felt the weight of the decision before me. I could take the safe route, use my connections to secure another corporate position, perhaps with Gordon's help. Or I could leap into uncertain waters with Amelia's team, building something that aligned with the values I'd discovered were non-negotiable for me. The old Emily would have calculated risk percentages and career trajectories. The person I was becoming simply asked, what would let me sleep at night? Where could I do work that mattered? With sudden clarity, I knew my answer. I texted Amelia, I'm in, send me the details. As I walked along the river, my pace quickened with something I hadn't felt since this ordeal began. Purpose. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, it was truly mine. The first months of Horizon Research Institute were a blur of 18-hour days, makeshift office space, and the peculiar mix of terror and exhilaration that comes with building something from nothing. We started in a converted warehouse in Hackney, all exposed brick and dubious heating, that Gordon's fund had secured at a bargain. The contrast with Mercer & Shaw's sleek Canary Wharf headquarters couldn't have been starker. Amelia brought 8 key researchers from the original team. I recruited James after his inevitable departure from the firm, along with Priya, a brilliant finance analyst who'd been repeatedly passed over for promotion because she refused to play office politics. Each person who joined us had their own story of corporate disillusionment, their own reason for taking the risk. We look like refugee camp for corporate misfits, joked Nikolai, our Russian-born data scientist, as we huddled around space heaters during that first frigid December. He wasn't entirely wrong. We were all, in some sense, exiles from the world we'd been trained to inhabit. The early days tested our conviction hourly. The specialized equipment the research team needed ate through our funding faster than projected. Regulatory approvals moved at a glacial pace. Gordon's initial investment gave us 18 months of runway, assuming nothing went catastrophically wrong. Something always went wrong. The ventilation system failed during a critical experiment. A promised government grant was delayed by 6 months of bureaucratic inertia. A former colleague from Mercer & Shaw attempted to poach our newly hired legal counsel with the whispered warning that Emily's little venture is one bad quarter from collapse. Through it all, I discovered strengths I never knew I possessed. At the consulting firm, I had been valued for my strategic thinking and client management, skills developed in sterile conference rooms. Now I found myself negotiating lease terms, fixing broken pipes at midnight, and holding the team together through setbacks that would have been unthinkable in my former world. You've changed, James observed one night as we shared takeaway curry after everyone else had gone home. We were reviewing budget projections that refused to balance, no matter how many times we adjusted the variables. Have I? I glanced up from my laptop, bleary-eyed. At the firm, you were always so... He searched for the word, contained, like you had everything mapped out 10 steps ahead. I laughed. Clearly, that person didn't know what she was doing. That's not what I mean. James set down his fork. You seem more alive now. Even when things are falling apart, you're fully present in a way you never were there. His observation lingered with me in the quiet moments between crises. The corporate ladder climber I'd been would have viewed our chaotic, underfunded operation with horror. That Emily had craved certainty, advancement, recognition. This new version of myself was learning to find satisfaction in the messy, unfiltered reality of building something meaningful. 6 months in, we faced our first truly existential threat. A pharmaceutical giant, coincidentally, one of Mercer and Shaw's major clients, filed a patent challenge against our main research pathway. The timing was suspicious. The legal costs alone could bankrupt us. I found Amelia in the lab late that night methodically reviewing data as if the legal sword hanging over us didn't exist. We should talk about contingencies, I said gently. She didn't look up from her microscope. Science is our contingency, Emily. Their claim is baseless. Our approach is novel. But proving that could take years we don't have. Then we'll have to find another way. Her calm certainty was both maddening and reassuring. This is just another form of the same pressure we faced before. Different tactics, same objective. Stop research that threatens established profit centers. Later that week, I called in every favor I had accumulated in my professional life. Former clients who respected my work, journalists who covered healthcare innovation, regulatory officials I'd built relationships with during my consulting days. I had always maintained these connections with careful precision, seeing them as career assets. Now I was deploying them for something larger than personal advancement. The story began to circulate in industry publications. An innovative research startup being legally bullied by a corporate giant. A David and Goliath narrative took shape. Gordon leveraged his considerable influence to arrange meetings with patent attorneys who normally wouldn't have returned our calls. 3 weeks of non-stop strategizing culminated in a meeting at the offices of Barrow and Winters, one of London's premier intellectual property firms. The senior partner, Eleanor Winters herself, had agreed to hear our case, though we couldn't possibly afford her standard fees. After our presentation, she removed her reading glasses and studied us silently. I held my breath. "Your science is sound and your documentation is immaculate," she finally said. "More importantly, the optics of this case are terrible for your opponent. A corporation using legal machinery to obstruct research into childhood diseases?" She made a disapproving noise. "I'll take your case. Reduced fee structure, success-based bonus." On our way out, Eleanor pulled me aside. "Richard Dalton called me yesterday," she said quietly. "Suggested I should decline to represent you. Said you were problematic." My stomach dropped. And yet here we are. She smiled thinly. "I've never particularly cared for Richard's approach to business, or his assumption that everyone shares his priorities." As we stepped into the weak London sunshine, Amelia nudged my shoulder. "Your corporate past isn't all baggage, it seems." I shook my head, still processing. I spent years building a network to advance my career. Never imagined I'd be using it for this. "That's the thing about tools," she replied. "Their purpose depends entirely on the hands holding them." Walking back to our makeshift office, I realized we had crossed some invisible threshold. We were no longer just playing defense, scrambling to survive. We were finding our footing, learning to leverage our unique strengths, even the ones forged in the very system we had left behind. The patent challenge dragged on for 11 grueling months, but Eleanor's strategy proved effective. The case against us was ultimately dismissed, with the judge issuing a strongly worded opinion about transparent attempts to obstruct legitimate research. The victory brought much-needed credibility, and with it, new funding opportunities. By our second anniversary, Horizon had moved to proper facilities in Cambridge, tripled in size, and advanced its primary treatment candidate to preliminary clinical trials. The research that might have been gutted under Mercer and Shaw's restructuring was now showing promising results for a rare metabolic disorder affecting children. I had just returned from a successful presentation to a group of European investors, when Caroline, our office manager, intercepted me at the door. "Richard Dalton's been calling all morning," she said, her expression making it clear how she'd handled the calls. "Says it's urgent." I nearly dropped my bag. "Richard? Did he say what he wants?" "Just that it's a matter of mutual benefit, that requires your personal attention." She rolled her eyes. Classic corporate speak for something dodgy, if you ask me. Richard and I hadn't exchanged a word since my dramatic exit from Mercer and Shaw. The firm had made several oblique attempts to disrupt our progress, the patent challenge being the most obvious, but never direct contact. Whatever prompted this, call it couldn't be good. After debating whether to ignore him entirely, curiosity won out. I returned the call from my office with the door firmly closed. "Emily," he answered immediately, as if he'd been waiting by the phone. "Thank you for calling back. I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," I admitted. "What could we possibly have to discuss after everything that's happened?" "Business," he said simply. "Things have changed at Mercer and Shaw. I'd prefer to discuss this in person. Lunch tomorrow." Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him at a neutral location, a quiet restaurant halfway between our offices. I told no one except James, who reacted with predictable alarm. "It's obviously a trap," he insisted as he followed me around the lab while I checked in with the team. "He's planning something." "Probably," I conceded. "But I want to know what it is." Richard was already seated when I arrived the next day, looking much as he had when I last saw him. Impeccably dressed, imposing, the embodiment of corporate authority. Yet something was different. A slight tension around his eyes, perhaps. The way he scanned the room before rising to greet me. After strained pleasantries and ordering, he got straight to the point. "The pharmaceutical landscape has shifted considerably since your departure," he began. "The Cambridge client, your former project, has lost significant market position. Their aggressive cost-cutting backfired spectacularly." I kept my expression neutral. "That's unfortunate for them." "Indeed." He sipped his water. "Meanwhile, your little startup has gained quite a reputation. Your clinical trial results are impressive. If you're here to gather intelligence, this lunch is over," I said, reaching for my bag. "I'm here to offer you a partnership," he cut in quickly. "Mercer and Shaw wants to formally collaborate with Horizon Research." I froze, certain I'd misheard him. "You can't be serious." "Entirely. The partners have authorized me to propose a strategic alliance, consulting support, operational resources, institutional backing, everything you need to scale your research globally." He leaned forward. "Your vision combined with our infrastructure, it's the logical next step. After you fired me, blacklisted me in the industry, and tried to legally destroy our research?" I kept my voice low, but couldn't hide the incredulity. "That's some definition of logical you're working with." Richard had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Business decisions, Emily. Nothing personal. And clearly events have proven your judgment was not entirely misplaced." The conversation felt surreal. 2 years ago, his approval had been everything to me. Now, sitting across from him, I saw something I'd never noticed before. Beneath the confident exterior, Richard Dalton was afraid. Not of me personally, but of what Horizon represented. Innovation happening outside his control. Success that couldn't be contained within his carefully maintained system. "Why now?" I asked bluntly. "Several of our healthcare clients have expressed interest in your technology. The market is shifting toward exactly the kind of research you've championed." He hesitated. "And frankly, your approach has gained traction within certain circles. It would benefit us to be associated with Horizon." Translation: the ethical stand that had made me a liability was now, ironically, a market advantage. Corporate values were as flexible as ever. And what would this partnership mean for our research priorities? Our team's autonomy? "Some adjustments would be necessary," he admitted. "Integration always requires compromise. But the resources we'd bring would accelerate your progress tremendously." I studied him, recalling how intimidating I had once found his presence. The memory felt distant, belonging to someone else. "I'll need to discuss this with my team and our investors," I said finally. "Send over the proposal." Relief flashed across his face. He clearly hadn't expected even this much. "Of course. You'll find the terms quite generous." As the waiter cleared our barely touched meals, Richard suddenly asked, "Do you ever regret it? Walking away from everything you'd built at the firm?" The question caught me off guard. It seemed genuinely curious rather than strategic. "No," I answered truthfully, "though I've regretted not doing it sooner." Back at Horizon, I called an emergency meeting. Watching my colleagues' faces as I outlined Richard's proposal was a study in emotional range, from outrage to cautious interest, from visceral rejection to pragmatic consideration. "It's a brilliant strategic move on their part," James acknowledged, reluctantly. "They co-opt our innovation and ethical credibility. We get their resources and reach." "It's a devil's bargain," Amelia countered. "They'll dilute our mission until it's unrecognizable." The debate continued late into the evening. By the time everyone left, no clear consensus had emerged. Alone in my office, I reviewed the formal proposal Richard had sent over. The terms were indeed generous on paper, but the fine print told a different story. Gradual transfer of operational control, phased integration of research priorities. My role shifted to Innovation Strategy Lead, a fancy title that would effectively remove me from decision-making. The old Emily would have analyzed this purely as a business transaction, weighing pros and cons with clinical detachment. But I wasn't that person anymore. This wasn't just about strategic advantage. It was about the soul of what we'd built. I thought about our researchers, working tirelessly on treatments that might never have existed if we'd followed the prescribed path. I thought about the families enrolled in our trials, placing their hopes in our hands. I thought about the culture we'd created, transparent, collaborative, purpose-driven. Some things once lost couldn't be measured in balance sheets or quarterly projections. I drafted a response to Richard, then set it aside to review in the morning. The decision ahead wasn't just about Horizon's future. It was about whether the very values that had led me to leave Mercer & Shaw were still the core of who I had become. I didn't sleep that night. Dawn found me walking along the river path near our Cambridge facility, watching the mist rise off the water as early rowing teams glided past. The tranquility stood in stark contrast to the turmoil in my mind. The practical arguments for accepting Mercer & Shaw's offer were compelling. Our funding, while stable now, wouldn't sustain us through the lengthy clinical trial process ahead. The regulatory hurdles would be easier to navigate with their experienced legal team. Global distribution of our treatments, if successful, would require infrastructure we simply didn't have. Yet something fundamental would be lost. I could feel it with certainty that transcended logic. When I returned to the office, Amelia was already there, bent over research data in the common area. "You've made your decision," she said, not looking up. It wasn't a question. "Is it that obvious?" She finally met my eyes. "You have a particular expression when you've resolved something difficult. I saw it the day you called me after being suspended." I sank into the chair opposite her. "If we accept their offer, we secure the future of the research. Isn't that what matters most? The science reaching the people who need it? The means shape the ends, Emily." She closed her laptop. "If we compromise on how we do this work, it changes what we ultimately create and who benefits from it." Her words crystallized something I'd been circling around. "You think they'll redirect the research toward more profitable applications?" "I know they will. It's what they're designed to do." She sighed. "But it's your decision. You've carried the heaviest burden building this place." "It's our decision," I corrected her. "I'm not making it alone." By mid-morning, the office was humming with tension. Everyone knew what was at stake. I called the team together, not to announce a decision, but to share a realization that had been forming since my conversation with Amelia. When I left Mercer & Shaw, I thought I was walking away from one job toward another. I began. But it was never really about jobs or careers. It was about the fundamental question of value, what matters and who decides what matters. I looked around at the diverse group we'd assembled: scientists, administrators, data specialists, communications, experts, all united by a shared commitment that transcended professional advancement. Their offer asks us to reintegrate into a system we deliberately left. They're not adapting to our values. They're attempting to absorb and neutralize them. James leaned forward. "But we could change things from the inside. Isn't that what you always wanted? To transform how business approaches ethical questions?" "I used to think that was possible," I admitted. "But systems resist change by co-opting challenges, not by yielding to them. If we accept, we won't change Mercer & Shaw. They'll change us." The debate that followed was intense but clarifying. By afternoon, we had reached consensus. We would decline the partnership but counter with an offer of our own. A limited collaboration focused on bringing our leading treatment to market while maintaining our independence and research priorities. Richard's response came swiftly. "The partners cannot accept a fragmented approach. The offer stands as presented. Consider carefully what you're walking away from." The implied threat was clear. If we rejected them, they would find other ways to compete with or undermine our work. Gordon Taylor's wisdom proved invaluable during this period. When I shared our decision and Richard's response, he nodded thoughtfully. "You've outgrown your origin story, Emily. This isn't about defying your former employer anymore. It's about charting your own course." His weathered face creased in a smile. "And as for their threats, big ships make obvious waves. They've shown their hand by approaching you at all." What followed was a period of intense strategic repositioning. We leveraged the mere fact of Mercer and Shaw's interest to secure partnerships with more aligned organizations, smaller, more nimble firms that shared our ethics but brought complementary capabilities. The healthcare investment community, always attuned to shifting currents, took note of our deliberate independence. 6 months later, our primary treatment received breakthrough therapy designation from regulators, accelerating its path to approval. The same week, I received an unexpected message from Richard's executive assistant. He was leaving Mercer and Shaw to start his own healthcare advisory practice and wanted to meet. Curiosity once again got the better of me. We met at the same restaurant, as before. "Congratulations on the breakthrough designation," he offered as we settled in. He looked different, less polished, somewhat tired, but also more authentic somehow. "The industry is watching Horizon very closely now." "Thank you," I said, studying him. "Your assistant mentioned you're making changes." "I'm leaving the firm." He stated it plainly, no corporate veneer. "After 22 years, effective next month." "Why?" I couldn't help asking. He considered the question carefully. "After you rejected our partnership offer, I was tasked with developing a competing initiative, essentially replicating your model but within our system." He shook his head. "I realized we couldn't. Not really. The culture, the priorities, the decision-making process, they were fundamentally incompatible with what makes Horizon work." "That must have been a difficult realization after 22 years," I offered, genuinely sympathetic despite our history. "It was illuminating," he corrected. "I've spent my career believing that business efficiency and social good were opposing forces that occasionally aligned by coincidence. Watching what you've built, how you've integrated them deliberately, has been educational." I was speechless. This wasn't the Richard Dalton who had coldly fired me in his office. "I'm starting a consultancy focused on helping companies transition to more sustainable and ethical operating models," he continued. "There's increasing demand, especially in healthcare, but most established firms are too entrenched in old methodologies to adapt." A wry smile. "Present company included. And you think you can do better?" I couldn't keep a hint of skepticism from my voice. "I don't know," he admitted with surprising candor. "But I'd rather try than spend another decade enforcing a paradigm I no longer believe in." As our conversation continued, I felt the last pieces of bitterness I'd been carrying dissolve. Richard had been both villain and catalyst in my journey, the embodiment of a system I needed to leave, but also the push that propelled me towards something better. When we parted, he hesitated. "I owe you an apology, Emily. Not just for how things ended, but for trying to make you choose between your conscience and your career. No one should have to make that choice. But many do," I said quietly. "Every day." "Yes." His expression was somber. "That's what I'm hoping to change, in my own small way." Walking back to Horizon that afternoon, I felt an unexpected sense of completion. The circle that began with my ethical stand in Richard's office had somehow completed itself. The conflict that had seemed so catastrophic had actually been the beginning of something more authentic, not just for me, but perhaps even for Richard. 3 years to the day after my suspension from Mercer and Shaw, we received regulatory approval for our first treatment. The celebrations at Horizon were joyous but tinged with a deeper satisfaction that transcended professional accomplishment. We had proven that another path was possible. That evening, I found myself alone in the office after everyone had gone home, looking at the framed photo on my wall. Our original team in that cold Hackney warehouse, exhausted but determined. We had been so fragile then, so vulnerable. Every obstacle had felt like it might be the one to break us. My phone buzzed, with a text from Amelia. "Turn on BBC Two, they're featuring our patient stories." I switched on the small television in the corner and watched as families shared their experiences with our treatment. A young girl who had regained mobility, a teenager whose developmental regression had halted, parents describing the difference it had made in their lives. This was the true measure of our success, not market valuation or professional prestige, but human impact, the kind that would never appear on a consulting firm's quarterly metrics. The journey from suspended consultant to the leader of a groundbreaking research institute had been neither straight nor easy. There had been moments when the safer path, returning to the corporate fold, accepting Richard's initial offer, had seemed painfully tempting. But standing in our thriving facility, watching the real-world impact of choices made from conviction rather than calculation, I knew with absolute certainty, some forms of success can't be measured in traditional terms. They can only be lived. The next morning I received an email from a graduate student requesting an informational interview. "I'm at a crossroads in my career," she wrote. "Everyone is pushing me toward traditional consulting, but your path has shown there are alternatives. Would you be willing to share how you navigated your transition?" I smiled as I wrote back, scheduling time for the following week. The cycle would continue, people questioning the established path, seeking alternatives, finding their own version of courage. My story wasn't unique. It was just one variation of a choice many face. The gap between what we're trained to pursue and what we actually value. Bridging that gap is rarely simple or straightforward. It requires sacrifice, risk, and the willingness to step into uncertainty. But as I looked around at what we had built, a thriving organization rooted in both scientific excellence and human values, I knew it was a journey worth taking. Not because it led to some perfect resolution, but because it led to integrity, that rare alignment between who we are, what we believe, and the work we do in the world. 5 years after Horizon's first treatment approval, I found myself standing at a podium in Stockholm, addressing a global healthcare innovation conference. The journey from that moment in Richard's office to this international stage felt surreal, a path I could never have mapped in advance. The future of healthcare isn't just about technological breakthroughs, I told the packed auditorium. It's about reimagining the frameworks we use to make decisions about those breakthroughs. Who benefits, who participates, who leads. As I spoke, I could see James in the audience, now heading Horizon's expanding European operations. Beside him sat Priya, who had transformed our financial model into a case study taught at business schools. Amelia couldn't attend. She was in Geneva meeting with World Health Organization officials about expanding access to our treatments in developing regions. We had grown beyond what any of us had initially imagined possible. Horizon now had research facilities in 3 countries, a staff of over 200, and 4 approved treatments with more in the pipeline. Our organizational structure remained deliberately different from traditional pharmaceutical companies. Transparent decision-making, shared ownership, prioritizing long-term impact over quarterly results. After my talk, a line of people waited to speak with me. Among them was a sharply dressed young woman who introduced herself as a senior associate at Mercer & Shaw. "Your story has become something of a legend at the firm," she said, somewhat hesitantly. "Though I suspect the official version differs from reality." I smiled. "I imagine it does. Things are changing there slowly." She glanced around to ensure no colleagues were within earshot. "Some of us are trying to shift the culture from within. Your example gives us, I don't know, something to point to when we argue for different approaches." Her words stayed with me throughout the evening reception. I had always seen my departure from Mercer & Shaw as a complete break, a rejection of one path for another. But perhaps it was more complex than that. Perhaps the ripples of that decisive moment had traveled in multiple directions, influencing not just my trajectory, but the system I had left behind as well. Later that night, unable to sleep in my hotel room, I scrolled through emails and found one from Richard. His consultancy had gained traction, specializing in helping established companies transition toward more sustainable and ethical practices. He was writing to share that Mercer & Shaw had hired him, a development that would have been unthinkable a few years ago. "The world is shifting," he wrote. "Too slowly, perhaps, but undeniably. What seemed radical when you took your stand is increasingly becoming essential business strategy. The firms that cannot adapt will eventually become obsolete." I set down my phone and walked to the window, looking out at Stockholm's twinkling lights. The path I had followed hadn't been about escaping the business world, but about reimagining what it could be. not rejecting pragmatism for idealism, but finding a way to integrate them. The following week, back in our Cambridge headquarters, I met with a group of graduate students who had requested a tour. Their questions were thoughtful, probing beyond the scientific achievements to the human dynamics that made our work possible. "What's the most important skill for the kind of leadership you've demonstrated?" one asked as we finished the tour. I considered carefully. "Learning to recognize the difference between necessary compromises and fundamental concessions," I finally answered. "Every organization faces constraints and trade-offs. The key is distinguishing between adjustments that help you achieve your core purpose and those that eventually hollow it out." "But how do you know the difference?" another student pressed. "In the moment, I mean." It was the essential question, the one I had wrestled with when facing Richard's partnership offer, and countless times since then on a smaller scale. "You have to be absolutely clear about what you're not willing to sacrifice," I said. For us, it was research integrity, patient access, and organizational transparency. When you know your non-negotiables, other decisions become clearer. That evening, I stayed late reviewing a new research proposal aimed at adapting our treatment protocol for underserved populations. The science was promising but would require significant investment with uncertain financial returns, exactly the kind of initiative that would have been immediately discarded in my former corporate life. A tap at my door interrupted my reading. Gordon Taylor stood there, now in his 70s but still sharp as ever, his investment fund having expanded its focus on ethical healthcare ventures. "Still working past 9, he observed, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Some habits never change." "This one's important," I explained, showing him the proposal. He skimmed it thoughtfully. "Challenging but worthwhile. The Gordon Taylor of 20 years ago would have told you to focus on more profitable avenues first. And the Gordon Taylor of today?" He smiled. "Thinks his return on investment with Horizon has come in forms far more valuable than money." We talked late into the evening, reflecting on how much had changed in the industry landscape since our initial leap of faith. Other organizations had emerged with similar models to ours. Established companies were being forced to reconsider their approaches as investors, employees, and regulators increasingly demanded greater ethical accountability. "You know what I've been thinking about lately?" Gordon mused as he prepared to leave. "That moment when you decided to reject Mercer & Shaw's partnership offer. If you had accepted, taken the safer, more conventional path, none of this would exist in quite this way." I had thought about that fork in the road many times over the years. "It wasn't just one decision," I said. "It was hundreds of small choices afterward that built this place." "True," he acknowledged, "but some choices opened doors that others close forever." After he left, I wandered through our quiet labs thinking about the journey that had brought us here. The original conflict that had seemed so devastating had actually been the catalyst for everything meaningful that followed. Not because the conflict itself was valuable, but because it had forced me to confront the gap between the professional identity I had constructed and the person I truly wanted to be. The next morning, I met with the graduate student who had requested career advice. She arrived precisely on time, nervous but determined, clutching a portfolio of her accomplishments. "Everyone says I should focus on credentials and connections," she explained after outlining her background. "Build a conventional career first, then worry about impact later." I recognized the familiar tension in her expression, the pull between the path of least resistance and the nagging intuition that another approach might be possible. "There's no single right answer," I told her honestly. "But I will say this. The decisions that seemed most professionally risky to me often turned out to be the most personally clarifying." As we continued talking, I saw something shift in her expression. Not certainty exactly, but the awakening of possibility. The realization that prescribed paths, however well marked, aren't the only ones available. It reminded me of what I had gradually learned through Horizon's evolution. Success isn't a destination you reach by following established rules. It's the ongoing process of aligning your work with your deepest values, of building something that reflects what you believe about how the world should work. The journey from that confrontation in Richard's office had never been about vindication, or even about proving an alternative model could succeed. It had been about the daily commitment to creating work worth doing and an organization worth building. One decision, one relationship, one principle at a time. And that, I had discovered, was a journey without end. Not a battle to be won, but a path to be walked with intention and integrity, continuously unfolding toward a horizon that moves as we advance, always beckoning us forward.